The Shanghai Composite outperforming U.S. equities so far this year and jumping 3% just in today's session. Our next guest says China's economy is on pace for a strong V-shaped recovery. Joining us now, Andy Rothman, investment strategist at Matthews Asia Fund. Andy, good to see you. Thanks for joining us. Let's start on that topic. I mean, are they experiencing a genuine V in their economy, and can we believe those numbers?
Yes, for the time being, there is definitely a V-shaped recovery across most parts of the economy. CapEx spending, consumer spending, which is important because that's the biggest part of the economy, drives growth, and new home sales, car sales, it's all looking pretty good. Not yet back to normal, but heading in that direction.
I guess because of 2020, we're all focused, obviously, on COVID issues. Should we be more focused as it relates to the China market on US-China tensions, which obviously have elevated in recent weeks and months? But is that a factor that should derail Chinese equities, or has the economy adapted such that it's no longer a risk?
You know, I think the biggest risk in the Chinese economic recovery is the same one here, which is how are we going to manage to handle COVID and how are they doing it? And that's really where things are looking pretty good. They've really managed to bring it under control. Over the last couple of months, there hasn't been a COVID death in China since the middle of April. And that's going to be the most important part. What happens with the U.S. is much less important because China is a domestic demand-driven economy, just like ours. And therefore, the tensions between Washington and Beijing are highly unlikely, I think, to derail things. Net exports, that's the value of a country's exports minus their imports, on average over the last 5 years contributed zero to China's GDP growth. And China only sends about 17% of its exports to the United States. So I think that's a big factor in terms of investor sentiment, but not a big factor in terms of performance of the economy or of investments in China.
Andy, what do you think of Ant Group going public? I mean, this is going to be a giant IPO. They chose to list in Hong Kong and Shanghai, interestingly, after Jack Ma a few years back came to the U.S. for Alibaba. What does it signal? Well,
I think for me, the most important element of this is the frustration that I have with the counterproductive efforts that some people in Washington are making to try and delist Chinese companies from the United States. Americans are going to invest in Chinese companies wherever they're listed, as they do now. If they're not listed in New York, that bolsters the Hong Kong exchange or exchanges in Singapore and London to the detriment of our own exchanges. It means those companies aren't subject to our regulations. So it's really, I think, for American investors, counterproductive.
Andy, when we consider some of the actions that have been taken of late against China, it's clearly elevated the debate as to who was to blame over the last couple of decades if people did kowtow towards the Chinese regime. Do you think CEOs of companies over the last couple of decades that have seen their IP stolen, for example, need to take more of the responsibility for some of these questions?
Well, I think that companies do that by their general nature. That's what companies need to protect their IP, whatever it is that makes them successful. But when you talk about kowtowing, I think you're referring back to a speech that Attorney General Barr made recently, where he said that China seeks to overthrow the rules-based international system and to make the world safe for dictatorship. Now, I just see no evidence to support that at all. China wants to make China safe for running its own system of governance, which we may not like, but we have to acknowledge that that's going to be there for some time, and we have to work with it. And I think engagement has been really successful for American companies, for Chinese people, but for us as well. China is a much better actor abroad. Look at Taiwan, for example. When the U.S. and China reestablished diplomatic relations in 1979, Taiwan was still an authoritarian one-party regime, and everybody was worried about its survival. Now it's a wealthy, thriving democracy. So I think going back to the process that's brought us where we are today is what's going to generate more progress for our economy, for our companies, and also for Chinese people.
But don't we need to keep national security in mind, Andy? I mean, aren't there some real concerns with companies like Huawei, with cyber hacking? I mean, the U.S. government is warning about this for a reason.
Of course, and I'm as attuned to the national security issues as anybody else. As you probably know, I spent 17 years as a Foreign Service officer in the State Department, mostly focused on China. So I'm well aware of those. But we have to make sure that when we call something a national security threat, it really is a national security threat. So, for example, is Huawei putting gear on the periphery of 5G networks in the UK a national security threat? Well, GCHQ, their version of our NSA, has been pulling apart all the gear and software as it comes into the UK for 10 years and has said every year in a published report, it's not a national security threat. Has this become a political excuse to deal with political problems in the United States rather than focusing on national security and our own commercial interests as well?
Andy Rothman, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.